Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for coming. My name is James Nixie. I am the manager of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, also known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So welcome today to, let me see, what was today's thing called? It was called Uzbekistan, Repression and Lack of Democracy in Central Asia. It's an appropriate title, of course. Uzbekistan, as many of you know, is of all the Central Asian states, it's the most beautiful, it's the most culturally rich, it's the most populous, it's the most ethnically diverse, but it's also the most controversial and it's the most repressive, particularly after the death of Niyazov in Turkmenistan as well. That merits an outstanding lineup of speakers, and that we have right here. On my immediate left, we have Craig Murray. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He's a former ambassador in Uzbekistan from 2004 to 2003 to 2005. Is that correct?
2002 to 2004.
2002 to 2004. Previously, he served in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Poland, and as I'm sure you know, he was sacked from his position as ambassador and then resigned from the Foreign Office subsequently. On my immediate right, we have, I need to look at my bio now because I didn't revise properly, as always. You probably would be better to do it yourself, actually, yeah. I've lost my bios. Actually, would you like to introduce yourself? Speak to my
I would get up and protest.
Yes.
I'm Shahida Tuliganova, and I'm an Uzbek journalist and documentary filmmaker based in London.
Natalia?
I'm Natalia Antlara, and I am BBC Central Asia correspondent based currently in Almaty in Kazakhstan since the office was closed down in Tashkent.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to hearing what you have to say later in particular, because Craig unfortunately has to leave us in just 20 minutes' time, I'm afraid. He suddenly had a diary clash. So I'm going to give most of the airtime to Craig right now. And I'll just kick off by really asking you, Craig, what, if anything, has changed since you were in Tashkent? And also, I'd like to know a little bit more about relations with the European Union, relations with the UK in particular, with Germany, which is a special interest case here. And if you feel that the new Miliband-Brown government has approached Uzbekistan in a different way to the government that you served under. And please, if you'd like to just speak for 5 or so minutes, then we'll take questions specifically for Craig before we carry on with the rest of the evening.
Thanks very much. Let me start by issuing an abject apology to you all, because I'm going to run away and leave you quite so quickly. As many of you may know, and I hope you can take a flyer at the back and find out, Nadira, my partner, is starting a one-man show at the Arcola Theatre, a one-woman show, possibly. By one of those completely unlucky coincidences, tonight was chosen by the production company as the press night. So I just have to get there, and it's something over which I have no control, and I'm very apologetic. To come to the questions posed, I have no doubt that Uzbekistan has got worse since I left. It was bad enough then. But not only have you got highlight events like the awful Andijan massacre, but the clampdown on opposition has continued apace, and we get more and more bad news every week. I'm at the stage where I'm actually nervous in the mornings to open my emails, because the people who are being killed or imprisoned are frequently people I know. We had the murder of Mark Weil. We had the murder of young Mr. Saipov, a gentleman who called to see me with Michael Anderson, I think, in my office in Tashkent, and discussed the opportunities for the press based outside Uzbekistan, even in the days when he was still a student. He wasn't much older than a student when he was killed. One of the more distressing recent amnesty reports concerned Ikhtiar Hamrayev, who's a political prisoner in prison with a very, very nasty open stomach wound at the moment. Just how he came across that in prison seems to be a matter of some debate. Those of you who've read my book will know that there was an occasion where I had a very nasty car crash in blizzard conditions and extreme cold temperatures, -30. And it was actually Ikhtiar and his father Bakhtiyor who came out and rescued us from the snow. So to hear of him being at death's door in prison, obviously was quite a blow. And I could go on. Mutawar Tajidayeva, sorry, I'm very bad at pronouncing names. Numerous others. The clamp down on individual dissidents has got worse and worse. And then we've seen these extraordinary recent elections in Uzbekistan, where the whole set of circumstances was just quite incredible. In any society where information isn't so strictly controlled, the narrative was so ludicrous as to be unpresentable. First of all, you have a president whose terms of office expires in January, and they announce that there's nothing in the constitution that says you have to have a new election before December. Then you have the idea that although he'd already served 2 terms, each much longer than the prescribed length, as they were longer than the prescribed length, they don't count. And you have him elected on a totally unconstitutional 3rd term. But worse than all of that, in my view, in many, many ways, and coming on to the second part of your question, was the total lack of response. And as far as I can find, total lack of response from the British government. You have an election which is 100% fake, in which none of the opposition parties are allowed to participate, where the president, ho-ho, gets 88% of the vote on a 92% turnout, despite the fact no independent observer could really see many people going to the polls at all. You have a very weak statement from the OSCE, and absolutely no statement whatsoever that I've been able to find from the British government. And if you compare that to our attitude to elections in other parts of the world, and not just in former colonies in Africa, but in other parts of the former Soviet Union, the contrast is quite astonishing. There's also been a weak, if no response, from the European Union. And that brings me on, I think, to a major point, which again relates to one of your questions, which is the ability of Germany to drive relations with Uzbekistan, partly by dint of being the only country that really shows much interest. And it's an interest which is entirely negative for the people of Uzbekistan, because it's entirely supportive of the Karimov regime. And my own, not just belief, but my own research would indicate that the driver behind that is the relationship between, the very strong relationship nowadays between Nord Stream, the Nord Stream project to bring a gas under the Baltic, Gazprom, and Gazprom's success in tying up Uzbekistan's gas reserves and Turkmenistan's gas reserves. And if you like, the effective death of Western plans for Trans-Caucasus or Trans-Afghanistan pipelines. And it seems to be, Germany seems extremely comfortable with the idea of an energy policy which is effectively dependent on Eastern supplies of gas. And with the idea that that then puts you in a very weak diplomatic position vis-a-vis not just Russia, but the Shanghai Cooperation States. And I think the German idea of Ostpolitik, which can be roughly translated as a view that human rights aren't important east of the Polish border, is extremely pernicious and very dangerous. And I think it's largely shaped by very hard-nosed commercial calculations. And in finishing on that subject, I should say that, of course, we shouldn't forget that Germany, unlike the United States, still has an airbase at Termez, and the defense relationship is still one of the major things that binds the German and Uzbeks so closely together. Mm-hmm. And I think that the European Union's relaxation of sanctions, despite the fact there's not only been progress, there's been negative movement since the Andijan massacre, is deeply, deeply shameful. I can think of no other word to describe it. And I'd like to finish with one last idea for progress, which is the association agreement between, or cooperation agreement between Uzbekistan and the European Union, which is something which does fall under community competence and under Commission rule, and all such agreements have a set Article 1, and Article 1 provides conditionality. Article 1 is a clause on which all else is dependent, and the conditionality refers to human rights and democracy. And being an agreement which falls within community competence, it's subject to the European Court of Justice. And the Commission's complete failure to make any attempt to pay any attention to Article 1 of the agreement with Uzbekistan is something which could well be subject to judicial review. That seems to me one of the questions we can look at as a way to take things forward. Because sadly there still remains very, very little political constituency. The number of people in Western Europe who take an interest in Uzbek affairs or who particularly care about the appalling regime there is too small to bring any effective political pressure to bear. That's a conclusion I've been sadly forced to over the last few years. So I think legal bureaucratic pressure is perhaps the avenue which we have to look at next.
Thank you very much indeed, Craig. I think that shows that, beyond any lurid headlines anyone might read, that you're a very thoughtfully spoken man and that you've made a serious contribution to our understanding of Uzbekistan in the last 3 or 4 years. So thank you very much for that. There is hopefully time, if you'll allow it, for 3 or 4 questions from the audience. We'll take them together to give you to take as many as we possibly can. So the microphone's about to rove, and the gentleman at the far right in the back corner, please. And we'll take them all at once.
Craig, good evening. My name is Frank Ledridge. I was quite recently torture prevention advisor at the OSCE. So I understand that the OSCE still, unless I missed something, retains something of an interest by way of its mission in Tashkent. Should it still be there? And if not, what can it do for all practical intents and purposes?
Great. Any more questions? Gentleman here. Sorry. A lot of work for you. This gentleman here in the striped shirt.
Craig, hi. Charlie Sykes from the MOD, but I have travelled in Uzbekistan for some time ago. I'm particularly interested that Karimov's stance seems to be one that will generate an undemocratic response and exacerbate Muslim extremism and Islamist extremism in Uzbekistan. Do you sometimes regret that your stance within the Foreign and Commonwealth Office meant you're not there to add perhaps a beneficial influence as opposed to being so outspoken with your saying?
2 more questions, please. Gentleman in the glasses and the striped sweater there. Just looking for one myself.
Hi, Tim Nolan, just interested member of the public who's been to Uzbekistan on holiday in the past. Quite a simplistic question, perhaps, but I'd still like to know the answer. Why do you think the UK is showing such a simple lack of interest or active disinterest in the whole affairs in Uzbekistan?
Final question, please. Gentleman in the jacket and blue shirt. This gentleman here.
I'm Len Brown, an independent television producer. I didn't make any television programs in Uzbekistan, but I did work on a cultural project there. I've got a very simple question. What would be wrong if Uzbekistan were in fact, inverted commas, democratic? Why would that, what would be wrong with that in terms of east-west, west-east? So why isn't it?
Thank you. Take it away, please.
Okay, I will try and answer those, Ben. You'll forgive me. I will unceremoniously dash, because I have to be in North London in 20 minutes' time. On the OSCE, in my time in Tashkent, which is receding into history, because it finished 3 years ago now, but in my time in Tashkent, the OSCE office did a very great deal of good and took a very active interest in human rights and democracy issues in Uzbekistan. I think places like OSCE officers, and it's true of both embassies and multilateral missions in general, very dependent on the guy you got at the top of it. You know, we had an absolutely excellent Turk who was superb. He really was superb, deeply committed. The guy before him, hope he's not a friend of yours, was totally useless. And I gather things aren't quite as dynamic now as they were before as well. The same, I'm told, is also true of the British Embassy. But in general, I think I'm not in general in favour of a policy of total isolation. I'm in favour of a policy which would include, for example, I would absolutely, I would, and I intend to, press the EU Commission hard to use, it's perfectly legitimate to use forced labour and child labour regulations to treat products produced under those circumstances as dumping. There's WTO precedent for that. So I would ban Uzbek cotton and products containing Uzbek cotton from the EU, because I don't think it does the population of Uzbekistan any good whatsoever. They'd all be better off if they were allowed to go through carrots. But in terms of things like closing an OSCE office as a sign of disapproval, no, I wouldn't do that. The OSCE, of course, is hamstrung by the fact that it contains a number of member states who have no commitment to democracy whatsoever, and by the fact that diplomatic protocol prevents those states that do have something of a commitment to democracy from saying that rather simple truth. And that's again, is a problem with multilateral institutions in general. And that gives some idea of my thought. In terms of influence, I have no doubt that the failure to provide any democratic alternative to the Karimov regime helps inspire extremist movements. There's no doubt about that at all. And I think the West's failure to identify itself with the need for democratic change, and in the period I was there, and I'm sure this is true, because I'm sure it was the perception of many Uzbek individuals, the West's identification of itself with the Karimov regime helped that, because it seemed there was no alternative but extremist Islam. But having said that, I think extremist Islam in almost all of Central Asia, and certainly in Uzbekistan, is extremely exaggerated. It's tiny, absolutely tiny. I used to, as a matter of policy, I had an armoured vehicle, I never used it once. I never took anyone with me anywhere. I used to wander around villages in the Fergana Valley I'd been told were too dangerous to go in, and I would go and take tea in the chai-khanas and speak to the people from madrasa. I never felt in any danger whatsoever. If you had a completely free democratic referendum tomorrow in Uzbekistan on instituting Sharia law, not 1% of the population would vote for Sharia law because they all drink vodka. That's a caricature, but it's not far off the truth. And I think that's very important. I'm not sure I ever had any influence in the Foreign Office to regret losing. Do I regret being sacked? Yes. The income was pleasant. I still rather stubbornly take the view that I was right and we had this ludicrously pig-headed view. And my own view is that we just completely lost our bearings in the aftermath of 9/11. The idea of the war on terror in an extremely unintelligent way being the overriding situation, so we were going to support anyone who said he was against Muslim extremism, no matter who he was. I think in those circumstances, if you were sane, you had to leave. So I'm not too bothered. Why is there lack of interest from the UK? I think the basic reason is lack of British interests. You know, there were some 30 British companies in Uzbekistan, full stop, when I was there. British American Tobacco was the biggest one, and they'd almost given up on their investment anyway. No real economic interest. There's virtually no Uzbek community in the UK. Most of what there is in the room now. It's not a large diaspora. So you haven't got the pressure on British MPs from their having a number of voters who come from Uzbekistan, for example. So there's no real political weight. And our policy was very much one of supporting those who had an interest. So when I was there, it was made absolutely plain to me. I was meant to play second fiddle to the Americans because they had the interest and we didn't. Nowadays, I think we're playing second fiddle to the Germans because they had the interest and we don't. And the the lack of British interest or lack of British influence is connected to our to our lack of interest there. Do we have anything to fear from a democratic Uzbekistan? No, I honestly don't think we do. This, I think, goes back to my point about extremist Islam. I think there is absolutely no chance whatsoever that a genuinely democratic Uzbekistan would come under an extreme Islamic regime. That's just completely contrary to Uzbek society, both today and in terms of many strands of its historical culture. So I don't think we have anything to fear at all. Of course, there's a regime in Tashkent which has a huge amount to fear from democracy, and sadly at the moment there's no sign of them losing the whip hand. Now, if you excuse me, I really must vanish. I do apologize.
Craig, thanks very much indeed. As you depart, you leave us wanting more. The alternative event tonight is the British Ambassador's belly dancer. I'd rather you didn't leave for that, appealing as it may sound. But we have two outstanding speakers who I'm sure can beat that tonight.
But we won't be doing belly dancing.
Absolutely. Good night. Right. My understanding of the protocol now is that we shall have a short discussion of, say, half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. We've got just over an hour before we have to finish promptly at 9 o'clock tonight. So, effectively, should we start with Natalia, randomly?
Sure.
I guess I'd like to know, really, do you think that the Karimov regime is inherently unstable? Is it, have the elections provided any greater measure of stability? And in the medium term, it seems to me that the crucial question is that Islam Karimov has to balance the competing clan interests. He comes from a very weak clan society himself, and that has enabled him so far to balance these interests. So perhaps it is that in fact Uzbekistan is less stable than it might have outwardly appear, despite 88.1% victory in the elections.
It's very sad that Craig Murray left, because I actually disagree with him on quite a few issues.
And please feel free to explore this.
Feels like cheating now that he's gone, but absolutely, it's my chance. But whether Karimov's regime is inherently unstable, I'd say absolutely yes, it is inherently unstable. I've just spent 10 days in Uzbekistan in December before the election, because we're not allowed to report out of Uzbekistan. So spent 10 days traveling around the country, talking to lots of people, and thing is that probably Islam Karimov probably would have won this election anyway. The question is, why would he have won the election? And I think the reason why he is the danger of Islam Karimov is what he has become, and he has become the only lid on that brewing discontent that one day will explode. And personally, unfortunately, I have less and less doubt that at one point it will explode and it will affect the entire region, because it is Central Asia's most populous state. I disagree with Craig on the point that Islamic radicalism is not an issue. I think it is becoming more and more of an issue, because it is becoming the only platform of expression of political discontent, because there is nothing else you can do. You know, you can't print an article in a paper, you can't speak openly, you can't go on the radio, you can't tell your neighbor that you dislike the government, because next day the secret services will be at your door, taking you off to a jail where you're likely to be tortured. And that is why the regime is unstable. Now, there are all kinds of things. You know, we do have great misconceptions about Uzbekistan. You know, you go there and it's grim. It's extremely grim. You can feel the fear. It's, as a friend of mine said recently, it's like being in the street in Tashkent is like watching black and white television. People do speak in whispers. But at the same time, ask anyone you know, what are the hopes? What could be different? And the thing that people told me, the only thing that they hoped for was that Islam Karimov would not run in this election, which would by no means mean any sort of democracy. It would just mean that he would bring someone else, maybe someone younger, maybe someone who would somehow open up the system. But he didn't. He ran again. He won again, and he will stay on. And probably longer he stays, bigger the discontent will be, because the needs are very, very basic. The needs are not democracy and freedom and free and fair elections. The needs are food for the family and electricity and gas, which they don't have, which is ironic in the country that is sitting on massive gas reserves. So that's what people want, and they're not getting it. And the government is giving them, you know, bit by bit, very little, just to keep them quiet. But, you know, 2 years ago, Andijan happened, and I think sooner or later something like that will happen. And I think in the meantime, and longer time passes, more and more people who are choosing Islam as their political platform, there will be more and more of them. And I think eventually that threat is very real.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Would you like to answer the same kind of question as by way of intro? Inherently unstable, the elections, etc.
Yeah, I agree with Natalia that Islamic extremism is a problem for Uzbekistan. It will be more problem later on. Unfortunately, with these elections, the opposition and any secular forces in Uzbekistan had lost their chance. At the moment, the Islamic sentiment is very strong, but not strong enough to consolidate itself as a proper political force. I guarantee that probably 5 years later, it will become a proper political force, which will create some kind of problem uprising based on Islamic slogans. And this is not something to frighten the Western observers or the Western public. This is the case. If at the moment, if this year, some part of the Islamic opposition in Uzbekistan was trying and willing to cooperate with the secular opposition, even though the secular opposition is mainly abroad, I think that 3 years later it won't be the case, because people are extremely disillusioned. The only way to save Uzbekistan from any future Islamic threat, and it's not because people want it, because this is the only avenue for them to seek some kind of change, is to open up Uzbekistan for some kind of democratic change. Allow pluralism, allow secular opposition coming in the country, and integrate into the politics. Otherwise, it's going to be a huge explosion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Craig talked about the relationship of Uzbekistan with various Western powers, with the US, with Europe, Germany and the UK. I wonder if I could ask you about relationships with countries closer to home. There are various key relationships here. Russia is an obvious one, new president coming in. Perhaps Uzbekistan will start asking for an increase in the price of gas. Afghanistan is another one. The Uzbeks are always worried about a resurgent Taliban moving north. Iran, China, and of course all of the other Central Asian states, in particular Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, with whom they have a kind of a competitive relationship in some ways, which of course they know they're losing out on. So how do you assess, if you don't mind going down those ones, which I've randomly highlighted again, how would you assess the relationship, the future relationship with those countries? Do you want to start off this time?
All right. I'll go with the neighboring countries.
Sure.
Uzbekistan has always behaved as a bully towards Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan for the weaker states, and it's still the case. With Tajikistan, Uzbekistan always exercised the leverage of gas and electricity, as well as a labor force. They shut down the border, and there are huge problems for Tajiks in Uzbekistan and Uzbeks in Tajikistan. With Kyrgyzstan, it's the same. It's about gas and water. And to give an example how weak Kyrgyzstan is the murder of the Kyrgyz journalist Alisher Saipov in October last year. That was actually a shocking thing. To kill a citizen of another country on the territory of another country is a bold move. But that exactly shows to what extent the Uzbek government and Uzbek security services treat their neighbors, in particular Kyrgyzstan, as something they shouldn't count with. And at the moment, if we look at the whole investigation issue of this murder, and what we hear from the Kyrgyz law enforcement agencies, is that they're trying to find the villains in the religious parties, like Islamic Party of Uzbekistan, Hezbollah Tahrir religious party, or some individuals, rather than pointing out at the proper people or at the villains who are based in the territory of a different country. And we can see how bullied the Kyrgyz government feels when it comes to the time for them to respond or who exactly killed that journalist.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Natalia?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with Shahida, and I think Alisher's murder was a really a very tragic and a very dramatic example of how Uzbekistan basically does whatever it wants in Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyzstan has become part of the, you know, you are in southern Kyrgyzstan and you feel like it's part of Uzbekistan, and those little freedoms that people had there, they're disappearing, and the Uzbeks are really gaining the upper hand. And you know, one of the Alisher was always the guy who reported on the kidnappings of the Uzbek refugees and on the fact that it was becoming less and less safe for them to be in Kyrgyzstan, and it's tragically ironic that he was murdered on that side of the border. With the others, with Kazakhstan, it's always been the competitive relationship. You know, we always joke that Karimov just hates the fact that Nazarbayev is doing so much better than him. You know, he kind of wants to be like Nazarbayev, but he can't. So, but there was this great poster. Remember the poster? And then there was a poster that we are no less than our neighbors, or something like that. Yeah.
This is sorry, just to continue. This is the expression of the Uzbek president, which is one of the slogans in Tashkent, which exactly shows the psychological problem of the Uzbek president, saying, if it's necessary, we're no less than our neighbors or anyone else.
Yeah.
Obviously pointing at the neighbor to Kazakhstan.
Yeah. But I think the interesting thing with very much so with Kazakhstan, less so with Russia, is that, you know, the basis of the Uzbek economy at the moment is migrant workers. There are millions of Uzbeks who are working abroad, who are sending the money back, who hate the regime because it forced them to leave, and yet they're supporting it by sending the money back to their homes, to their families. They're mostly in Russia and in Kazakhstan, some in Korea, South Korea, but mostly in Russia and Kazakhstan. Millions of them. And for both Russia and Kazakhstan, it has become a political issue, especially for Kazakhstan, because Nazarbayev and the Kazakh government, which is a booming economy, this powerhouse of Central Asia, the success story of the former Soviet Union, they know very well that if something goes really wrong in Uzbekistan, it's going to be above everything else. It's going to be their problem, because you'll have millions and millions of people fleeing across that border. So they're going to do everything they can to help Karimov. And for Russians are somewhat in a similar position, except Russians and the Kazakhs can use it also as a leverage on Karimov, because if they deport those illegal migrants back to Uzbekistan, then Karimov faces a problem that he will not survive. He'll have millions more of unemployed young men without jobs, without money, angry at the government at home. So, I mean, technically, it's Russia and Kazakhstan that are propping up the regime. You know, probably, I'm pretty sure that without them, and that's the thing about the open borders in the 20th, 21st century. I think in very many ways, the situation in Uzbekistan today is very comparable to Iran in the 1970s. But now it's so much easier to travel, it's so much easier to get out, it's so much easier to send that money back, that the regime change does not have to happen in order for people to have a slightly better life.
The last time I was there, Natalia, I was on a visit with a group of academics, and as far as the officials from the foreign ministry we spoke to were concerned, then the primary security concern for Uzbekistan was Afghanistan. It was all Afghanistan. It's what they wanted to talk about more than anything else. I suppose they do have legitimate security concerns, though. What are the legitimate security concerns of Uzbekistan, as opposed to the ones that they use as excuses, they use to make up? I mean, I'm particularly interested in how important you feel what's happening in Afghanistan is to Uzbekistan's future.
I think it's a huge issue for the Tajiks, for Tajikistan. I think it's much less of an issue for the Uzbeks. And I think any talk about radical Islamists and the possibility of the Uzbek radical fighters, because we can speak about the rise of radical Islam inside Uzbekistan, but this is not the militant threat. At this point, it's not a militant threat. I think the the government rhetoric about the militant threat coming from Afghanistan, I think it's blown out of proportion. To be honest, I don't think it's that big of an issue.
And yet it's what they mention all the time.
I think that Uzbekistan doesn't have really major issues for concern in Afghanistan. The north of Afghanistan is secured by the Uzbek warlords in charge. They kind of protect the border. Everything is fine. The Uzbek government used to help them and probably still helps them. What the real issue for Uzbekistan, unfortunately, is not addressed by Uzbek authorities properly, is the drugs trade. And unlike the Tajiks, who are cooperating with the international agencies in terms of fighting drugs, and at least trying to do something to stop the huge heroin flow into the region, Uzbekistan's government is actually not doing that much. We still don't know the real figures of how much of the heroin which is smuggled through the border with Uzbekistan has actually been seized, and who exactly is seizing it. Greg was pointing out a few years ago that he saw personally the trucks of strange trucks which were crossing through the border with Afghanistan on the famous Friendship Bridge, which were not stopped. Has it changed? We don't know. We certainly know that Afghanistan has started producing heroin instead of just growing opium. And to produce a heroin, you have to have special chemicals. Now, where these chemicals are coming from, we only can suspect the well-known crime list is Russia, Korea, and Uzbekistan, which does have chemical factories, which produces chemicals needed for production of heroin. So whether these issues have been addressed, no. I've been talking to drug enforcement agents all over the region as well as international bodies, and they're extremely disappointed by the lack of cooperation of the Uzbek authorities. So this is the real issue, and Uzbek government is not doing much to address it.
Thanks very much. In the past, Uzbekistan has always pursued bilateral relations with all of these different states, but recently it has begun to be more of a multilateral player with institutions such as the SCO and the CSTO. How serious is it about cooperating multilaterally with these Eurasian organizations? EEC is another one. Is it genuine about this? Is it a possible move forward, or is it just, again, is it just sort of for show? Shahida.
Well, Shanghai Cooperation Group is extremely important for Uzbekistan because the government feels extremely isolated recently from the rest of the world, and this is the only avenue for the international politics it can exercise. I would say that this is more the marriage of convenience rather than the genuine diplomacy and cooperation. There are certain issues which do kind of unite this Shanghai Cooperation Group governments. Those are terrorism, which all of them explain in the very broad terms. For Chinese, it means the Uyghurs. For Uzbeks, it means something else. So they don't know terms about it. The only workable thing about the Shanghai Cooperation Group is probably the gas. And it's still being debated. There are huge issues between Uzbekistan and Russia about the gas. Uzbekistan recently has increased the gas prices. The relationships are not doing that well, and during the recent visit in Bishkek, from what I know, and Natalia can comment on it because she's been there, President Karimov and President Putin had hardly spoken to each other.
I wasn't there when they met. But yeah, the Russia-Uzbekistan relationship is definitely the marriage of convenience, and they don't. Basically, Karimov had no choice. You know, that's what it was, and it was amazing to see the Andijan events in 2005, this massacre, the Western condemnation, and all of a sudden this. The West, America's biggest ally, turns around, and the first visit he makes is to Beijing. And that's what we've seen over the past 2 years since Andijan. And this is something that the government is using to show the West that, you know what, you don't want to be with us, there are others who do. You don't want to be our friend, we'll find other friends. And I think they're doing it very successfully because there is a growing and a very successful cooperation with China. There is a tense and rather murky but still very strong relationship with Russia and with other Asian states, you know, and India, Japan, all of those countries too, they are willing to talk to the Uzbeks, and that's where I think West is losing out big time.
Okay, listen, as a last question before I kind of open up the floor for the last 30 to 40 minutes, and Craig tried to finish on sort of an optimistic note and suggesting some ways forward. I mean, I suppose I'd like to ask you, we've obviously been through sanctions on and off, visa bans on and off. I mean, I'd like your assessment as to whether you feel these have worked or not, and if you feel we do have any leverage over Uzbekistan, what the West can do, what any organisation in the West can do. Just as a final.
I think the European Union's rapprochement policy doesn't work at all. In fact, it produced the contrary result. It gave the green light to the Uzbek government to go and kill or silence its opponents. 2 weeks after this, after the sanctions were eased, we had the murder of the Kyrgyz journalist Alisher Saipov. And on December the 10th, we have another case of an Uzbek poet in Bukhara region whose house has been stormed by armed men, and now he's arrested, and his family is scattered all over Uzbekistan. So it doesn't really work. I don't know how many people, how many brave and outspoken individuals the Uzbek nation can lose so that the international community could finally realize that there is no difference between Islam Karimov and Robert Mugabe, and he deserves exactly the same treatment.
Good.
I have a slightly different opinion, because maybe the rapprochement did not work, but I think the sanctions did not work either, and I think partially because of the media response to Andijan, the Western response was very swift. I think the West did not know what to do. I think the West never knew what to do when it comes to Central Asia. I think the West lost back in the beginning of the 1990s, when they really, especially the United States, really had a chance to influence and shape the way things would be in Central Asia. I think the sanctions were embarrassing for the European Union. I think they were a joke. Sanctions which banned 12 Uzbek officials from traveling to Europe, and then, you know, next day the officials were sacked, and one of them still managed to go to Germany and have a heart surgery. You know, sanctions that imposed a ban on arms sales that never took place anyway. You know, symbolic sanctions, and Uzbeks understood really well that those were symbolic, but it soured the relationships. And I think what we're seeing now is, and from talking to lots of diplomats in Uzbekistan as well, although none of them really want to talk, what you're seeing is that Karimov is, when it comes to the West, I think Karimov is in a bargaining position. Karimov says, well, you know, if you want to come, you are the ones who left. If you want to come back, this and this and this is what you have to do. And the West is not going to do it, because they will seriously compromise their position, or they will have to compromise position in, this is what Germany is pushing for, because Germany, and I think they have a valid point, they say we need to talk to him somehow, one way or another, because there is no one else to talk to. So if we want to have any sort of presence in Uzbekistan, we should talk to him. Now, you know, on a very personal level, I have a problem in talking to Karimov in any way, but maybe that's what Europe needs to do. I mean, I don't know. I'm glad I'm not the one making that decision, but...
Fair enough. Listen, I've asked many of the most obvious questions, but there's some obvious and not obvious questions still to be asked, and perhaps you can help me with that. We've got 45 minutes left, so I'll open the floor up, and I think we'll have plenty of time to get through for a good deal of them. There's a gentleman in a white shirt and a black jacket towards the end. We'll take them one at a time this time. We're not quite so pressed for time.
My name is Jamal Harwood. I'm a member of the Islamic political party Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is very well represented in Uzbekistan. And I certainly agree with the speakers in their disagreement with Craig Murray over the actual impact of Islam in the region, because, you know, we are seeing a massive rise in that. But I do question, and I would ask the panelists, I was very surprised by your comment where you did say that it is a very real threat, and tried to maybe imply that this is merely because of the oppression of the regime, that maybe is a backlash that they're turning to Islam. I mean, there was a very interesting survey by the University of Maryland in April last year, throughout the Muslim world. It didn't include Uzbekistan or Central Asia. It's very difficult, as you know, to have a survey there. But we're seeing 70-75% of Muslim populations, including quote-unquote pluralistic or moderate states like Indonesia, with the Muslims expressing a desire to return to Sharia law and the Caliphate. And our experience is very much that the people of Uzbekistan are also looking to that. I mean, the Caliphate, of course, is
So you're going to get to a question, yes?
Yes, I mean, I'm just really saying, what do you see in threat? This is one of the most, if not the most oppressive governments in the world. And, you know, Muslims are seeking a caliphate which has an independent judiciary, nobody's above the rule of law, representative government, people have the right to vote, and so on and so forth. So I'm surprised by your use of the word threat, particularly from political organizations such as our own.
Okay. Please. Shahida? Tough call for the first question, I agree.
I think we recently did a film for Newsnight about Hizb ut-Tahrir in Central Asia and in Uzbekistan, and talked to lots and lots of Hizb ut-Tahrir members. I know lots of them personally, especially in southern Kyrgyzstan. It's very difficult to talk to Hizb ut-Tahrir in Uzbekistan. A human rights defender in Uzbekistan recently told me that he said, you know, the day when Hizb ut-Tahrir appeared in Uzbekistan was the day when the last main opposition leader fled the country. And I think Hizb ut-Tahrir has been very, very successful in filling the political vacuum and in getting the message across. I think their success is largely due to the fact that there are no other voices, and they're effective as an organization. Of course, there is a proclamation, the organization is peaceful, believes in peaceful means, but I think that the rise of Hizb ut-Tahrir, the threat that it poses is because, and I think many people in the region would agree with me, is not actual Hizb ut-Tahrir, but the fact that Hizb ut-Tahrir does not seem to be while it's very effective in mobilizing people, it doesn't seem to be very effective in actually bringing the change that it promises. And therefore, when we talk about it as a threat, what I mean is that it becomes the breeding ground. And I think at some point, people who join the organization because they desperately need that change, they don't see the organization bringing the change for them, they will leave the organization and turn to even more radical means to achieve the change that they need.
It's certainly not our experience of that happening. But you're right that there are think tanks in America which are trying to push that line.
I don't think it's just the think tanks in America. I think that it's definitely a lot of people in the region as well, and I think there have been cases of that. I think a lot of people start out as Hizb ut-Tahrir, but then turn to much more radical means. And I think there is a great difference between being a Hizb ut-Tahrir member in London and being a Hizb ut-Tahrir member in Central Asia, where the reason why you join is because your husband is being tortured in jail, is because you have no voice at all, is because you have no money to feed your children. And that's why you hope this is the only way that you can see that can make your life different.
Shahida would like to comment on this,
I think Hizb ut-Tahrir managed to seize the ground in Uzbekistan in a place where no other forces are available. The political opposition doesn't exist, and there are no other Islamic or other religious political parties over there, and Hizb ut-Tahrir is a political party. And both me and Natalia, we're working with Hizb ut-Tahrir people, and for me, being a Muslim, it was a very tough call to talk to them. For example, from what I understood by talking, especially to women, their husbands are in jail, and Hizb ut-Tahrir people, the other people in the party, they are helping them. So they're using very convenient methods of Islamic Brotherhood, for example, helping people around, something which government fails to do. So when the government fails on certain social issues of satisfying social demands of the populations, this is why the Hizb ut-Tahrir has a huge ground in Uzbekistan. On the other hand, straight from the beginning, the Uzbek government actually closed the gates of other Islamic ideologies. It started to control the religion, and there is Hamid Ismailov here from the BBC who probably can comment on it. There was no independent Islamic thinking in Uzbekistan, not during the Soviet Union, not after the Soviet Union, and people were seeking the knowledge. People were seeking some other forms of Islamic debate, and there was no debate in the country. Hizb ut-Tahrir came in and started working undercover very effectively, implying the means of secular, basically, political parties. And that's how it won hearts and basically the minds at the moment of the people in Central Asia, especially in Uzbekistan. I really want to know what will happen with Hizb ut-Tahrir or any other religious organizations like that when Uzbekistan becomes a democratic country, and the floor will be open for any other ideologies in Uzbekistan, and then we can truly see who is the most popular.
Ladies and gents, Hamid Ismailov is indeed the foremost. Would you like to comment on this, Hamid? Is that very embarrassing for you? Sorry, okay, well perhaps later. I would very much like to hear from you on this. Did you have a question, lady? Thank you very much indeed. This lady here.
Hi there, my name is Siobhan Senator from Uzbek Media. Part of the problem, obviously, with Uzbekistan is the lack of information that we get here. To what extent are journalists within the country able to operate still at all? And is it simply impossible for foreign journalists to operate within Uzbekistan?
Talia.
Well, I was there in December, but I wasn't there as a journalist. I went as a tourist and did some journalism, although I wasn't supposed to. It's pretty impossible. It's pretty impossible. Even there are still few organizations that are accredited. There are people who manage to retain their accreditations, which it's Reuters and France Press. Those are the only two who are accredited. It was extraordinary because for the election, even the Russian media that is generally viewed as friendly, even the Russians were refused accreditations. No one was allowed to go in. But obviously, the problem is not for us. The problem is for the journalists who are trying to operate from within the country, and there are still some, and they're very, very, very brave, and they try the best they can. It's very difficult. It's difficult about the censorship is so strong. It's so widespread. You can't. The internet is fully censored. You know, you can't get on any website at all. And there's this constant game of proxy servers, and people figure out a way to, open, I don't know, Radio Free Europe or a BBC Uzbek service website, and then the government figures out the way to block the proxy that they figured out they could use to open it. It's constant, and in internet cafes around the country, there is always an administrator who actually checks the websites that you're checking, and if you want to copy a file, for example, you want to copy a file from the internet, you want to copy your email, you can't use your USB stick. You have to give it to the administrator of the internet cafe, who will then copy it for you. And there are even signs that I've seen in some internet cafes that say that if the material you're viewing or reading or using in any way disrespects the Uzbek state, you may face a fine. I don't know whether people do or not, but it's certainly there. No, the control is pretty impressive. They're everywhere.
Shahida, are there any more Saipovs out there? I mean, are there any more radical journalists doing extraordinary work, critical work, or was he absolutely unique?
Well, first of all, he was a Kyrgyz journalist of Uzbek origin, and he was operating from the other side of the border. He was great because he was strategically placed out there. People were seeing him in and out. There are a couple of journalists whom I know personally who are still working. Unfortunately, the rest of my friends have left and got political asylum somewhere else. And I have to mention the case of another journalist who is actually a nephew of President Karimov, who is in psychiatric hospital for the last couple of years. So that's how they're treated. Now, unfortunately, this whole atmosphere of isolation and a lack of any media freedom, and especially internet, lack of internet access, does aggravate the fact that we don't have any journalists anymore, or professional journalists who are capable to work. I'm receiving bits and pieces of information from a variety of sources, mainly from the Fergana Valley, and they're saying to me, can you please publish it somewhere, somewhere? I can't, because you have to double check the facts, the stories are badly written, and there is no way we can do the training for these journalists so we can get information, the professional information from out of the country. You get bits and pieces of information here and there, and then they have to be pieces together, and it's really hard. I have to mention to you the other case of Umida Niyazova, another journalist and human rights defender who was in jail for 3 months, I think, earlier last year. And she was actually the last one who was able to work. The rest of the people, honestly, I am not aware that they're able to do anything. A couple of cameramen whom I knew very well resorted into advertising recently. They don't want to do anything about politics.
Thank you very much. Next question, please. Lady just here.
Minister of the Open Society Foundation, what is the status of the investigation into Saipov's murder on the part of the Kyrgyz government? What statements have been made to date by the Kyrgyz government about his assassination, particularly with regard to what the two of you claim to be an outrageous, not invasion, but entry into Kyrgyz territory by Uzbek secret services? What has been the immediate impact on the media scene in southern Kyrgyzstan in the wake of his murder, and what if you have been on Uzbek language media outlets in the closer region of Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, or those that concentrate on Uzbek affairs?
Do you want to?
I think Natalia has been there recently, so let's start. Okay. You start and then
I haven't checked literally in the past 3 or 4 days, so I don't know whether there's been anything or not, because we should have the investigation results any time, any day now. So far, it's been nothing. I talked to Alisher's father just in the last week of December, and obviously, apart from being absolutely devastated, the family is also very concerned about safety, about the way that the investigation is going, because it seems that now, first of all of Alisher's bank accounts are still frozen, and it, not that he had many, but the one that he had. The investigation does seem to be focusing still on him rather than possible, other suspects in the murder. In the very beginning, one of the official lines of the investigation was the Uzbek, that Uzbekistan was somehow involved, the involvement of a foreign state. Some officials openly said Uzbekistan. That does not seem to be the case anymore, and the last official things that we heard were pointing at some organized criminal group, and the family is expecting for that the result of the investigation will be just that, an organized criminal group, or just some criminal who somehow, for whatever reason, decided to kill him. Mm-hmm. And the family is saying that they will come up with a statement after that, and it seems that the statement will link the murder to Uzbekistan and to Alisher's work, which seems to everyone to be the only logical explanation to why he was killed.
I don't think that the Kyrgyz authorities are trying to make any real investigation. From the very beginning, I was one of the 4 people who were volunteered to give witness account to the Kyrgyz police. And from the line of questioning there, I realized that they were only interested in Alisher's links to Hezb ut-Tahrir and Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. Maybe 5% of all the questioning in a matter of 3.5 hours were related to his journalistic activity. I was particularly disappointed by the recent interview of the person who actually in charge of the investigation, head of organized crime unit in the Kyrgyz Interior Ministry, who gave an interview to one of the Kyrgyz newspapers saying that Alisher was a doubtful person with doubtful connections, and going that far, that claiming that he had contacts with the leader of Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Tahir Yuldashev. Now, I really want to see whether there is any evidence whatsoever for such claims, number one. Number two, the whole line of his talking makes me think that why do you make a victim, who is Alisher, a criminal? And therefore, I really hope that they will try to come up with something tangible than that, rather than looking for some criminal somewhere in Hezb ut-Tahrir or Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan or some mafia business. Probably maybe they can target their efforts on finding out the true murderer, and especially those people who ordered the killing. As far as the media in Tajikistan, Uzbek-speaking media in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan is concerned, there is only one Uzbek language newspaper which operates in the north of Tajikistan called Time, and there is another newspaper in Uzbek language in southern Kazakhstan. Those are the only two, and they were supposed to be our potential partners of the Siyasat newspaper, because me and Alisher were thinking of expanding the newspaper to the neighboring countries. So the talks are still on. Unfortunately, the newspaper is not published yet because there are no, the police still didn't give the proper documentation for the newspaper, which they seized, and therefore the newspaper cannot be published. The website for the newspaper was hacked, all the files were deleted, and therefore we have to start everything from the scratch.
Thank you very much. Next question, please. Gentleman at the back with open white shirt.
Sergei Christo, I used to work at the BBC Central Asian Service a very long time ago. A question, I mean, there is no doubt, we know from history that regimes like that do collapse if the West confronts the dictators. Of course, another matter entirely is that, as we heard from the ex-ambassador, the West isn't interested very much in countries like Uzbekistan and other countries. So, do you see any possible scenario under which the West would be interested slightly more?
Maybe when a suicide bombs start exploding in Uzbekistan, maybe that will attract the Western attention. I don't see us exporting gas directly to the West because Uzbekistan normally does it via Russia. We don't have any pipelines, so therefore West is not interested, even though the European Union, Germany, the United Kingdom less, actually, most of the European Union countries are receiving gas from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan via Russian pipelines.
Yeah, it's all energy.
Yeah, no, I don't really. I don't see West becoming any more interested. I see the West regretting big time not being very interested in 20 years down the line, but I don't think that will make West interested at the moment because there are no direct pipelines. There is no direct, very obvious interest. But I think it's something that can and will affect the West. In the near future.
Interesting. Prospects for trade? You said the Japanese were getting very interested. I've read a lot of reports on that recently.
With Asia, absolutely. With Asia, with India, especially with China. What's going on with China in Central Asia is fascinating in general, and China is becoming, this is becoming China's backyard, but with the West.
Next question. Gentleman in the, right by the door at the back, please.
Thank you very much. Taj Mustafa from Hizb ut-Tahrir. In terms of the relationship with the West that you just mentioned, I sat some months back in a meeting with a Belgian ambassador to the OSCE who said that whenever the West comes up with new anti-terror laws, such as 28-day detention in Britain or such as rendition, that the regimes in Central Asia actually clap their hands in glee, because when they then discuss with Western officials, they basically say, who are you to lecture us about what we do to our citizens when you're involved in all this? So I think one of the very defining things, defining the West view, interaction, relationship with Uzbekistan is the quote-unquote the war on terror. And I think as long as that is the case, the West will have a huge reluctance to intervene in that region. And I think also they may not say it loudly, they have concerns about what they would call the rise of Islam. How that's perceived as a threat, which we don't believe it is. But I think those are two very important factors which are shaping a collusion, I would call it, between some Western governments, especially Germany, and the brutal regime in Uzbekistan. And tribute to those brave journalists who are still trying their best to get some information out of that region.
Thank you very much. Shahida?
Well, I agree with you that, yeah, the war on terror was a big thing. It actually played a great, it did a favor to Islam Karimov in portraying the Islamic boogeyman in Uzbekistan in particular. I would strongly disagree that Hezbollah Tahrir was of any particular danger to the current regime, and I think the Western governments and the Western government should really pressurize to release the Hezbollah Tahrir members from Uzbek prisons, who are thousands and thousands of people who were jailed sometimes from 7 to 15 years in jail for just being prisoners of conscience. Yes, but there is an Islamic threat in the nearest future, probably in Uzbekistan, but not immediate future, but nearest future, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
No, I agree with Shahida. I don't know how much of an issue war on terror is right now, because I think West is also quite sober in its relationship with Uzbekistan. I think the West has kind of realized that there is just simply not that much they can do. And that was an issue when there was an American air base in Uzbekistan, and when the Americans did all the lip service which they definitely did to Islam Karimov. I don't think that's that much of an issue. I think Karimov is, at this point, is simply doing whatever he feels he needs to do. I don't think there is any leverage left that the West has, other than a slight desire on the Uzbek side to sort of get back in the club, or at least not to be seen as vicious and evil. But I also think they are at the point when they just don't really care. I mean, see us as evil, you know, so what? We've got Chinese and the Russians. So I don't think the war on terror is now plays that big of a role.
Yes, indeed. The lady just here in blue in the neck scarf.
BBC World Service. Two brief questions, if I may. You talked about the inability to access internet and whatever, but there is still quite a lot of shortwave radio and some medium wave radio coming from Hamid's service, coming from Liberty, and so on. Do people listen, or is that also so frowned upon that is also cut off from them? And secondly, what about the wider neighbours of the CIS? What about Ukraine? What about Georgia? Are other, if you like, the wider family, ex-family, actually taking any interest, or is Uzbekistan off the map as far as they're concerned? May Mr. Saakashvili and President Yushchenko maybe taking interest?
I think it's a very good question, especially when it comes to Ukraine and Georgia. And I don't know so much about Ukraine, but I believe it's a similar thing. They're definitely taking interest, and I think the members of the X family are beginning to take each other very seriously and are really trying to reestablish ties, more so now than ever before. I don't think there is any sort of pressure that can come from Ukraine or from Georgia on the regime like Uzbekistan, simply because of energy politics, and because Uzbekistan's got so much gas that, you know, in that case, you know, Georgia and probably Ukraine, that will be a different relationship, but all they can hope for is to have some access, to have some sort of a relationship. So it's the other way around. It's Georgia and Ukraine using Uzbekistan to talk to Russia, rather than, you know, pressuring them somehow. I mean, we're seeing the same thing with, you know, the Georgia and Azerbaijan, the gas-rich, repressive state next to this really impoverished semi-democracy. Mm-hmm. And it's Azerbaijan that is having much more influence on Georgia than the other way around. So the pressure I don't believe it can come from within the family. As for shortwave radio, yeah, not shortwave, I mean, on FM in the Fergana, yeah, I think people listen, but there is still, you really feel the information vacuum as well. People don't really know what's going on. There's that as well.
But is it now? I mean, is there in a sense that, you know, in years gone by, you know, when the wall came down, we discovered, for example, that 37% of Romanians had been listening, which was an awful lot of people, although nobody would ever have even guessed that.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure Hamid knows the numbers better and knows how many are actually listening. Last time I was in Fergana Valley in the Uzbek side, people have told me that they listen. And in Tashkent as well. So people definitely listen. How many listen, I don't know. But I also, met lots of people who were really desperate for information. I mean, I met people in Samarkand who said, "Can you tell me what happened in Andijan 2 years ago?" Mm-hmm. That was 2 years ago, and people still don't know. So.
I mean, we're all dying for you to contribute here.
You're listening more.
What can I do?
How many people listen to you, Hamid?
Why not with me like this? Shahida.
I obviously don't know how many people listen. I know that in my neighborhood in Tashkent, which is very traditional Uzbek neighborhood, Mahala, every single household does listen to BBC, even on short waves. That's how my mom starts her day and how our neighbor starts their day. They listen to Uzbek broadcasts. Some of them don't really speak Russian, but they listen to Russian service. They listen to everything, and especially in the Fergana Valley. Where the population is more active, and they kind of listen and they pass on the news to others and then goes to the market. How do you calculate that? They maybe don't listen themselves directly, but they pass on the knowledge to others, and it happens in our chayhanas and our tea houses, in the markets, and etc. And that's how the news is spread.
That's how the news travels.
As far as
so old-fashioned radio does better than the internet.
No, definitely. There is no question that in that situation with Uzbekistan, it's much more effective than the radio. And I think that was also the reason why Alisher's newspaper was so effective, because really all you need is to get one paper into the village, and then everyone knows what the paper talked about.
Did you have one more thing to say?
No, I just wanted to add something to the Ukraine-Uzbekistan issue. Natalia is absolutely right in saying that this is a huge energy thing. Uzbekistan does supply Ukraine with gas, and this is the problem. So Uzbekistan has got more leverage. Just wanted to say that not shortly after President Yushchenko was elected first time, 4 Uzbek refugees were deported, extradited from Ukraine to Uzbekistan, and we don't know what happened to them ever since.
It strikes me as being unlikely that somebody like Saakashvili, who's always trying to be pro-Western, Western-leaning, at least superficially, is going to want to have too much to do with Islam Karimov, except as an alternative to Russian gas or to Russian. So I'm not sure he's going to want to cozy up to them too much.
No, there is. I don't think there's any attempt to cozy up, and I think he would see how it would be damaging for his reputation. It probably pretty much goes against his beliefs as well. But I think it's also a very pragmatic relationship, and I think, for a place like Georgia, like Iran, who helps out when Russia cuts gas, but how much gas can you take from Iran? They've got their countries to run, they've got to take care of themselves. They can't afford to have foreign policy.
Yes, the lady just there, sort of towards the back on the right.
Fiona Anderson again from the BBC. I'm just going to remind Natalia, because also I think people are beginning to leave, and some people are quite depressed about the situation in Uzbekistan. I know that you're trying to raise money for Alisher Saipov's family, so do you want to tell us how we can help you?
Thanks. It's, before everyone else leaves. Alisher was 26, and he left a 18-year-old wife and a 6-month-old daughter, who are in a pretty difficult situation right now. So we are trying, there is an effort to pull some money together for the family, mainly for the babies, for the girls' education. Unfortunately, the trust fund that is going to be set up has not been set up yet.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes left, really, so don't be too shy of your questions. So anybody else, preferably not from the BBC, unless your name's Hamid Ismailov. Okay. Gently. Yes, please. Yes, please. Sorry.
We heard a lot of grim news about human rights. I just wanted to ask, how is the country doing economically, and how much are the citizens of the country benefiting from the economic development?
I recently spoken to a friend of mine who is an international banker, honestly, to ask her how Uzbekistan economy is doing, and she said the country is bankrupt. Nobody knows what the hell is going on with Uzbek economy. I'm sure that even economics ministry or finance ministry have no idea whatsoever what is going on. We have about 2 million officially registered economic migrants outside of Uzbekistan. Probably unofficial figure runs up to 5 million. They give huge contributions to back home, as Natalia mentioned before. We don't know exactly the scales of this contribution. The suggested figure was at about $2 billion a year, but again, there's no official information about that. So yeah, the people do not contribute at all. They're actually forced to leave homes to seek work in Russia, in Kazakhstan, and even in Tajikistan, who is actually always done much worse than Uzbekistan. People are seeking work in Ukraine, in Poland, etc. At the same time, government doesn't do anything to try to legalize these migrants in Russia to protect their lives. We don't know how many migrants, maybe hundreds of migrants are dying in Russia because of poor working conditions, and we hardly know the causes of their deaths. Not to mention the xenophobia existing in Russia. As far as I know, only Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Poland have done some efforts to legalize the migrant labor from Uzbekistan, but so far that's it. And those were the initiatives of the governments of these respective countries, not the Uzbekistan's government.
Of course, they tell you that GDP is on the rise. They tell you that manufacturing is increasing. I certainly see plasma screen TVs being in the markets, but I actually don't see any being sold. It's a bit of a confusing picture.
I think that for people, things have become a little easier over the past 2 or 3 years. And I met with this so-called journalist in Tashkent who was telling me that what the government has done, it has actually, while doing nothing for the people, while not building economy, and it is a mystery how the Uzbek economy works, no one seems to understand, and there is no cash in any cash machines in Tashkent, and you know, you have, I was in a bank trying to exchange money, and there was this guy with like piles of money. He was apparently buying a flat, and it was just this piles, you couldn't walk into the room, but there was money everywhere, and inflation and all of that. But what the government has done is the government closes its eye on the black economy, and the black economy is the only one that works. So everything is a black, there is no real economy, there is black economy, but the black economy works. Obviously it's the black economy, so it can only work so far, but no. But there is a bit of, there is more construction than there was even a year ago, I would say, and there is, people say that things are a bit easier, but there's been also an awful price hike all across the region, the world really, but in Central Asia and in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan, it was really felt. And you go outside of the capital, there is no gas, there is no electricity. You know, it's in Samarkand, and it's really strange to see this amazing, this beautiful place completely run down. Seems to be no effort to actually invest in restoring the tourist sites, filling up the potholes, giving the electricity.
But, well, the mosques are being restored, it seems to me, if nothing else. In some
yeah, to an extent, the mosques, but nothing around them. I mean, everything around them is in a complete decay.
No. Probably 2 more questions, I think. No more than that. Stephen, so gentleman just here on bottom right, just to make things difficult for you.
Stephen Nash, British Georgian Society. I gather there was a large Uzbek trade delegation here either last month or the month before. I just wonder what this delegation could have achieved.
I asked the British ambassador in Tashkent the same question, although it was off the record, so I should probably not say that, but he said absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I heard the same thing, absolutely. Right, last question. I think you put your hand up before anybody else, absolutely. Actually, we'll probably have time for one more since that was such a short question, in fact.
I was just wondering if some of you have ever met Karimov, interviewed him, and personally...
Have you?
Never had an honor.
Okay, well, we have 2 more questions since we were such short ones. Lady just there, and the gentleman here at the front.
Just wondering if you could give any insights into the child labor and cotton situation, whether it's improved or deteriorated, and whether you think pressure from Germany and the EU can have anything other than a cosmetic effect given the demand from the EU.
least.
There is a person here who knows all about it, I think.
Who did the report?
Simon Ostrovsky, who did a report for Newsnight about cotton and child labor, and he's a driving force behind change.
I saw that one. I don't want to make you repeat yourself.
Thank you, Natalia. Well, I think one thing that the film that I made didn't address, for those of you that did see it, was that the consumers in the West actually could have a very big influence. Uzbekistan is the second largest exporter of cotton in the world, and even though there's a massive demand for Uzbek cotton in the eastern garment manufacturing nations, that demand is created over here because it's created through the clothes that are made there and then sold on the high street in the UK. So I think people on the high street in England, in the United States, and everywhere, they can have a very strong influence on what happens in Uzbekistan. And from what Shahid told me, the Uzbek government is very concerned about what happens to the cotton industry. And I don't know, maybe you could say a little bit more about that, how they're worried.
Well, the Uzbek government is worried by the Western response to the cotton industry, and for several reasons. First of all, the cotton industry is tightly controlled by somebody in the government, and obviously people are losing their money. Secondly, it exposed the huge problem of child labor in Uzbekistan, which unfortunately is not decreasing, it's an increase. The recent report, and Alisher Ilhamov is probably in a better position to answer this question, by UNICEF, made by the Uzbek government, about finding out how many children are actually working in cotton fields. The survey was made in March, and in March no cotton is being picked on Uzbek cotton fields. The cotton picking season starts in September. So why did UNICEF, together with Uzbek government, didn't survey the cotton fields in autumn where all the kids are out there? So we don't know how many exactly children are being exploited together with their teachers who are acting as guardians, and schools are closed, and etc., etc. So we're losing not only on, we're not only exploiting children, the children are losing on their education. The schools are closed sometimes for 3 months in a row, and this is an important period for children to study. Plus the effects of pesticides and other chemicals which are used in Uzbek cotton fields to produce cottons, they are harmful for children. Maybe adults can take them, children cannot. There were no surveys on this issue whatsoever. The only reason Uzbek government is using child labor is because no other people want to pick cotton, because they pay really peanuts and sometimes don't pay at all to farmers. Farmers are not interested to go and pick cotton. They really don't want to grow cotton because it doesn't pay anything. There are lots of unemployed people in Uzbekistan. They could have go and work and pick cotton. They're not interested. They better go to Kazakhstan or Russia as migrant workers. So the only resources left for Uzbek government to exploit for cotton are kids. So kids are there, you don't need to pay them anything. There are no contracts between parents and children and the schools or local authorities about them being exploited in the cotton fields whatsoever, nothing. So do we know? No. But at the same time, the Uzbek government tries to keep the Uzbek cotton's price down, and this is the only way they can achieve it.
So, last question, make it a good one.
I hope it's a good one. Very quickly, just over a year ago, the president,
introduce yourself.
Charlie Sykes, the president of Kazakhstan, wrote, in my view, a very interesting article in The Spectator, suggesting that perhaps the West could learn from him in terms of growing democracy from grassroots rather than imposing from the top. And that's not the point of my question, although that was in itself generally further discussion. The reason he got asked to write the article was clearly because of a bloke called Sacha Baron Cohen. And I wondered whether or not Uzbekistan needed a Borat to directly targeted at character. In order to raise the profile.
Being an Uzbek myself, I would love to have an Uzbek
Borat. They did. They said the Uzbeks.
The boneless people. But I want him to make the film about Uzbekistan and raise the profile. I would say we won't be offended. We won't take it as seriously as Kazakhstan.
See, I disagree completely, because at least if he had picked anyone else, if he had picked Uzbeks have enough troubles, Kazakhstan Kazakhstan is okay. They got a life, and it was the last thing the Uzbeks want is some Sacha Baron Cohen making fun of them.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that was an outstanding entertainment. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to everybody. It really is good to have two people here who have such intimate knowledge of Uzbekistan, and I know that you both made a real huge effort to get here tonight. So thank you very much once more. So that's it. Thank you very much.